Welcome back to A Case for Cannabis. My name is Alfredo Matthew, founder of Working World LLC, and I'm here with the amazing Zachary Knox, partner at Knox and Ross Law Group. Zach, great to have you today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Right? Now, I've only met you recently, but I've heard you're quite a ball player. Ronnie West tells me you all used to hoop a lot back in college.
If you let me tell it, I used to hoop Ronnie West up a lot in college, and I'm sure he'd probably say the same thing himself.
Yeah. Now, Cal goes deep because meets you folks everywhere, and the Knox family goes deep because it seems like the Knox family is everywhere. Tell me a little bit about your family. It seems like you have a very unique family who is now all in the cannabis industry in one way or another.
Yes. So I'm the only non-physician in the family.
Okay.
The other four, my two sisters, my two parents, are all physicians, and they all practice in the area of cannabinoid medicine at this point, or endocannabinology, as they would call it.
Yeah. And everyone else went medicine.
Yeah.
You went law. And you didn't just go law, you went law MBA.
Yes.
And they went medicine MBA.
Yes, they did.
Tell me a little bit about your decision to pursue law and an MBA.
I almost tripped into becoming a lawyer. And at the time, before I became an attorney, I was working in sales, and I was looking for ways to expand my career. And I wasn't really satisfied with the options that I had. So I looked at going back to school. And at the time I was thinking, I was a sales professional, I'm gonna go get my MBA and continue on this business trajectory. And a friend of mine was studying for the LSAT. And so, at the same time I was studying for the MCAT. And we were helping each other with quizzes and study questions, and I found that I was doing pretty good on the law school exam questions. So I decided to sit for the exam, what the heck. And I got a decent score, not a great score, but a decent score. So amongst the 8 or 9 business schools that I applied to, I also applied to 2 or 3 law schools, just to throw it in the mix. And USF Law was the only school that accepted me that also offered a scholarship.
Which is pretty great.
So when I found out, I called my parents and I said, I guess I'm going to be an attorney. And my father immediately starts in with all his attorney jokes.
Yeah.
It's been
every family, right, would love to have a doctor in the family, but you already have that covered.
Yes.
It's also nice to have a lawyer in the family.
Yes.
And so now you're able to do that, but your parents actually encourage you not to go into practicing medicine.
Yeah, so growing up, watching them practice medicine, my mother was an anesthesiologist and my father was an ER doctor.
Yeah.
And they put in long hours, grueling hours while we were growing up. And they always told us, don't go into medicine, do something else, do something for yourself.
Yeah.
I joke that I'm the only one that actually listened.
Yes,
right?
yes.
But even my sisters who followed, my parents' footsteps and became physicians themselves, they didn't want to practice traditional medicine.
Yeah.
So they went and got their MBAs as well, and now they're doing work in the cannabis space.
Yeah. Well, there's definitely the little bit that I know of your family. There's a rebellious spirit.
Yes.
You're nonconformist.
Yes.
You don't just listen to what the medical school, the medical profession teaches. You're kind of carving your own path.
Yes.
And there's also a tremendous focus on equity.
Yes.
And inclusion. And later today, actually, we're going to be interviewing your sister, Rachel. So she's going to go deep into the medical side, and I'm really excited to explore the Knox family and what you all are doing on the medical side, because you support that business, that practice as well. But you have chosen a different path. As a lawyer, tell me how you got involved in the cannabis industry, because you're not a criminal defense attorney, which is historically what a lot of, attorneys have been involved with cannabis. Yeah. You come at this with a different lens. How did you get involved, and what kind of law do you practice?
Yeah, so I'm a business and tax attorney by training. And when I first got out of law school, it was right around the time that the financial crisis was happening. Mm-hmm. Firms were shutting their doors, and it was a real challenge to find a place in the legal field. I was fortunate enough, I got hired by a firm out in Point Richmond that specialized in criminal tax defense. Mm. And if you can imagine, at that time, just about every cannabis operator in California was a nonprofit collective or a cooperative, and they were all at high risk for being audited and potentially being referred to the Department of Justice for prosecution.
So we're talking like 2010, yes. 2011.
Yes.
Medicinal cannabis was legal, and so a lot of these nonprofit cooperatives were operating under that statute.
They were operating under the medical program, and because they were nonprofits, you know, there's a bunch of tricks and gimmicks they were employing to remain compliant with the program and still operate their business. Now, of course, all that's changed now that commercialization is in place, but you know, there was a lot of business to do for the firm just in terms of audit defense, representation at the U.S. tax court, and even, you know, working with the Department of Justice for those cases that were being referred for prosecution. And so that was my introduction to the industry as an attorney. Mm-hmm. A couple of years thereafter, I branched out and started my own firm. But fast forward a decade later to now, cannabis is almost all that I do.
Wow. Criminal tax defense.
Yes.
That sounds reactive to federal government and criminalization.
Yes.
Things have changed. Tell us a little bit about how things have changed, especially since 2015. It feels like in the last 5 to 6 years, compliance, the legislation, commercialization, as you call it, like the recreational cannabis market has become legalized.
Yes.
How has that changed the nature of your work?
It's been less about being a backstop against any potential enforcement as an attorney, and more about the transactional nature of commercial cannabis. I mean, what's happened since 2015, this industry has been commercialized, whereas sort of previously when it was all medical, it was sort of looked as a niche area servicing patients. And
cancer patients.
Cancer patients, other patients who have a distinct medical need. There's some naysayers out there who would say that people were getting medical cards just so that they can consume, and I'm sure there's some truth to that. But I think the world has looked at this industry very differently with commercialization. And on the federal level, things have not changed a whole lot. But at the federal level, there's also what they call the Rohrabacher-Favre Amendment. And what that means, without sounding too much like a legal wonk, is that there's no federal funding for federal enforcement of cannabis laws against operators who are operating in compliance with state law.
I did not know that. When did that get passed?
I want to say it was about 2015, 2016.
That is significant.
And the significance of it is that states like California immediately moved to pass a robust regulatory regime, really to protect their nascent cannabis industry.
Wow.
Right?
Okay. So that's under the Obama administration.
Yes.
Here in California, I gotta imagine this medical, cannabis industry has been growing, evolving. I mean, the industry has always been here. It's just in the informal economy. Yes. California is starting to recognize, hey, if we formalize this, that's going to generate tax revenue. That is it's potentially a major new industry. It's a major new revenue source. but the only way that we're going to be able to protect this industry is if we regulate it.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about regulation and compliance, because I've heard you say if you're going to operate in cannabis, number one is, right, inventory and your staffing. Third most expensive thing is compliance. How has this kind of evolved and taken off?
Well, I joke with my clients that they thought they were getting into the cannabis industry, but they're really getting into the compliance industry. And yes, from an expense perspective, right, your personnel, your inventory, followed by meeting your compliance obligations. And so, you know, not only was passing the cannabis program difficult in the first place, but I think a lot of people involved with the industry would tell you is that there was substantial sacrifices made to get that initial legislation passed, right? Examples of that would be being agreeable to higher taxation, right?
Yes.
The original cannabis legislation that California passed had a substantial amount of that tax revenue earmarked for things like law enforcement. And so these were some of the carrots that cannabis advocates had to be willing to include to get a skeptical legislature to pass a program.
And what year was this?
I want to say that it was either 2016 or 2017.
All right, so this is before equity licensing and all this. It was originally passed in the legislature, and people think, oh, California is so liberal. California is not a homogenous state. You've got very conservative areas, very liberal areas, and when you're trying to do something statewide, you need to work across the political spectrum. So there are many folks who continue to this day not comfortable with cannabis legalizing. So in order to get it passed, there had to be very strict regulation, because I'm hearing a lot from operators about how onerous and capital intensive the compliance is.
Yeah, and I think that was in part a knee-jerk reaction. Look, cannabis has been stigmatized in this country for the better part of the last 100 years.
Yeah.
You're not going to flip the switch overnight and all of a sudden convince everybody that this should be a viable industry and that this is not going to destroy communities, destroy children. There's still many non-believers, people that object to cannabis, and it's not just that they're not comfortable with it. There's a lot of regulators who think that this should remain illegal.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you get into legislation, right? We're all familiar with the concept of sausage making. There's going to be some things in there that you may not want. And I think the struggle since then has been to drill down on where regulation is needed and dial back where regulation has been overextended. And I think that's the legislative process around cannabis that we've been seeing over the last few years.
Yeah. And so, right, so I used to teach history.
Sure.
For 10 years. So I'm actually really enjoying trying to understand the arc of how much this has been changing. And as I'm talking to folks in the cannabis industry, it's like the last 5 years, like 50 years of, 2015 is a lifetime ago. Yeah. That's a whole nother thing. So around this time, 2015, 2016, it started, recreational cannabis is starting to get legalized.
Yeah, starting to get traction. Starting to get traction at the legislative level at the state. People are talking about it. I think that there was a couple of ballot initiatives at that point that were trying to legalize cannabis that ultimately failed, but it was signaling the direction the state was going.
Did California legalize recreational cannabis first?
No.
Who did it first?
I believe Colorado did it first.
Colorado did it.
Yes.
Because now it's like every other day. Like New York City just legalized cannabis, right?
Yeah.
Now it's like every other, right? Mexico.
Was it 29, 32 states or something like that now? California was the first to pass medical.
Okay.
But they couldn't get enough support to pass recreational. I think Colorado was the first. I think Oregon passed it before California.
Okay.
Maybe Washington passed it before California.
But so now California is trying to kind of take the lead again in some areas, right?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about equity, because part of your law practice has turned into working with municipalities and supporting equity initiatives. How did that start to roll out, and what is the role that you're playing with some of these programs?
Well, the city of Oakland was the first jurisdiction in the country to institute an equity program for the cannabis industry. And at the time, the state had already passed its commercialization statute, and the city of Oakland was getting ready to pass its local ordinance to support the industry. And members of city council essentially held everything up and said, we need to address equity here. We need to address the fact that the war on drugs resulted in targeted enforcement of the cannabis laws, particularly against communities of color. And now that we're going to legalize this industry, we want to ensure that some of those same people who were the subject of over-enforcement have a place at the table. And so Oakland was very specific about what they wanted to see. They wanted diversity in ownership of cannabis businesses. And now we've seen equity programs crop up elsewhere that also support that idea and have even expanded it to diversity in the workforce. But I think what the council members were objecting to is that a lot of people of color went to jail behind cannabis, and the industry they saw coming in was largely white. And so they specifically moved to ensure that there would be more equity in ownership in the cannabis industry, and that's how their program got started. Oakland was the first to get an equity program established. They were also the first jurisdiction to publicly fund technical assistance for their equity cannabis operators. My wife's consultancy was the first firm in the country to be awarded a public contract to provide technical assistance to these equity operators.
What firm was that?
Her company's called Make Green Go.
Mint Green Go? Okay, cool. I did not even know that she was involved in incubation and other technical assistance services as well.
Yeah, and so we've expanded since then. We're contracted to do work in San Francisco, Fresno. I've worked with equity operators in Long Beach, Los Angeles, Sacramento.
And outside of California as well?
Outside as well. Massachusetts, Illinois. We've been talking to equity groups in New York as they begin to roll out their program, Portland, Oregon. We've been involved all over the place.
And I don't know you that well, but something I appreciate about your perspective, because if I talk to some people, they say equity programs are failing. What they were intended to do and the nature of this cannabis industry, how capital intensive it is, how difficult it is to survive and thrive and grow and scale. Equity operators don't have a chance. You seem to be a little bit more optimistic and a little bit more realistic that just because you have an equity license doesn't mean you're gonna make it in business. Just because you start a business, right, as an entrepreneur does not mean you're gonna make it. Most entrepreneurs fail. That is part of the learning curve and the nature, and this is a very, very competitive industry.
All of that is true. And I would say I think I have a little different perspective from your typical operator, even equity operator. Arguably, I've just had the benefit of working with so many of them that I think I get a little different impression. I think it's important to understand what the goal of these equity programs were. Nobody can really hand you a successful business.
No, certainly
not. They can give you an opportunity and they can sort of create a little runway, but you still need to launch that plane yourself, right?
Yeah.
And, don't get me wrong. I think all of these equity programs and even cannabis legislation, period, to a certain extent, is still largely an experiment.
Yeah.
I think regulators are still trying to figure this out. Operators are still trying to figure this out. And so is there room to improve these programs? Of course.
Yeah.
Could local government or state government be doing more? Of course. Could they put more resources into equity? Of course. I mean, these are all things that we're fighting for. But you're right. This industry is really capital intensive to get into. And any assistance for equity is beneficial towards getting an equity sector up and off the ground, right?
Which is kind of a novel idea. It's novel in a way, right? Silicon Valley benefited tremendously from military-industrial complex, right? A lot of public investment that allowed the internet to take off, the computer industry to take off. We're talking about some very intentional equity-focused government investment to help diverse owners maintain ownership in the cannabis industry. I think public-private partnerships are essential to our kind of entrepreneurial, to starting new industries. But this is revolutionary, innovative. I mean,
it's something that I don't think government has done before, which is look at their past actions and how they impacted a community negatively, and to say, we're going to redress that with very intentional, targeted policies to try to support this industry in communities that have been suffering from over-enforcement.
Right, so now, right, you know, when I interviewed Kika Keith, she speaks very eloquently about the importance of redemption.
Yes.
And taking the taxation and the increase in revenue that comes from this industry and reinvesting it in communities that have been ravaged by the war on drugs.
Yeah.
Back to our earlier point about the political spectrum is not homogenous in California or anywhere else. This is, right, where the sausage is made, this is gonna be the battle between how do we address communities that have been negatively impacted, particularly Black and Latino communities, and all of the capital that's coming in, the commercialization that's coming in as, you know, things are going, I mean, this industry is going to explode in the next few years. The tight regulation that exists right now, I imagine is going to be loosened. And as it gets loosened, it's going to allow bigger corporate players to get involved.
Yeah, I think that's the direction it's heading. I think that if you listen to the regulators, particularly at the state level, that's the direction they're steering it. But I think one of the promising things here, at least in California, is this idea of equity has really caught on. And at this point, even has state support. So there's state funding that has been granted.
But if you listen to President Biden and Kamala Harris, we're now talking about equity at the national level.
Absolutely. And what we should be talking about is equity well beyond just the cannabis industry. There's no reason that equity couldn't be instituted in any other industry that you could think of, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, there'll be some interesting things to explore there, and I'm sure when you get a chance to talk to Rachel, she'll even bring up health equity, right?
Yeah. So equity as a concept is now in the mainstream, and it is in our public consciousness.
Yes.
And it's not just, right, I'm familiar with like diversity initiatives and all this, and that's like business ownership and that's workforce, that's kind of numbers. But there's all different kinds of equity, right? Health equity, outcomes. Tell us from a lawyer perspective, how do you put equity into the law? Like how could this potentially play out, and what would you like to see?
Yeah, I think with regard to equity, I would like to see it broadened out. I'd like to see it more accessible. I think it's not a coincidence that the largest markets in California have all instituted equity programs. And in some of those markets, at least for right now, the only opportunity to participate is through an equity program. And so I think
in Oakland is the only way to participate through an equity?
Oakland, no, but right now, if you're trying to get a new license in San Francisco, it's only available to equity. I believe Los Angeles is the same right now, that the only licenses that they are issuing at this point are equity licenses.
51% of the company needs to be owned.
So that's where that's where it varies a little bit. Each jurisdiction has their own equity standard. In Oakland, it's 50% exactly. In Los Angeles, it's 51%. In San Francisco, you have the option of the equity partner being a 51% owner or a 40% owner, but they also have to have the title of CEO of the business. So all these jurisdictions structure their program a little bit different. So they'll define equity a little bit differently. Their ownership requirements for equity are a little bit different.
But this is a grand experiment.
Yes.
We need lots of experiments. We need lots of communities and municipalities trying things out, and then we need to see what the outcomes are.
Yes. And just an example of that, when we got started with the Oakland program back in 2017, their goal was to have 40 equity operators. They wanted to issue at least 40 equity permits. I think they've issued close to 700-800 now.
Wow.
Right?
Wow. And you work with about 300 of them.
That's 700-800 permits.
Yes.
Now, some of these operators hold more than one permit.
Okay.
So I think, somewhere between 350 different businesses holding permits.
All right. It's one thing to get a permit.
Yes.
It's another thing to kind of launch and build an enterprise.
Absolutely.
I've heard, I was just in Santa Rosa the other day, they had 60 permits, licenses, but there's only 12 operators who actually have their enterprises up and they're doing business. What do you, and your wife also works more on the technical assistance side, what do you think, because I'm talking with a lot of entrepreneurs, what is essential for someone to enter into this industry, and now you can put your MBA hat on, and get a business up and running, right? Because we got some folks who love cannabis, they grow, boom, they don't necessarily have the business acumen. Then you got the folks with the business acumen, don't know anything about cannabis. What do you think is the right mix?
Well, I think it's led to some really interesting partnerships. I think one of the challenges in this industry, and this goes doubly so for equity, people come in and they really underestimate how capital intensive it is to get these things off the ground. Getting a business up and running requires capital generally, no matter what kind of business it is.
Yes.
But if you think about, let's say, cultivation, for example, the amount of money you have to pump in to secure a facility, to build out the tenant improvements, to equip it, to get your initial clones. All these things are paid for even before you turn the lights on. Let alone, produce a couple of harvests to where you can start generating revenue. I think the other thing that people didn't anticipate when this industry sort of got off the ground in California is how much resources it would take, not capital-wise, but government resources for people to make their way through the licensing process. When we got started in Oakland, there were severe bottlenecks early on. People were securing their spaces and starting their build out, but they couldn't get inspections. There weren't enough building inspectors. There weren't enough fire inspectors for the number of businesses that were coming through.
And if this is anything like inspections and compliance with city government and anything else, that's a whole industry in and of itself.
Yes.
Getting permits, getting licenses. I mean, there's bottlenecks, there's red tape, there's corruption, there's all kinds of things people are dealing with.
And we've seen all of it in this industry. We've seen all of it. At the time, people were getting in thinking they would be operational in 6 months.
Yeah.
It was taking 18 months, 20 months.
Meanwhile, you're paying for a lease on a property so you can be in compliance to get this, right? Like a landlord is not, hey, I'm sorry, I'm not generating any revenue yet, I'm waiting on my permits. That's fine as long as you can pay rent.
And you'll hear stories about folks who are 4 years in and carrying costs on leases, hoping that they'll eventually get a license.
Yeah.
I don't know if Kika Keith told you about her experience with this, but her and her partners were sitting on a property for at least a couple of years before the process even opened up down there in Southern California.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're going to see that in New York too, watch. They're buying up property already.
People are buying up property with the intention of applying for a license, but they're going to have to sit on that property for a couple years.
Until New York rolls out its program, and then depending on when that program rolls out, how long is it going to take to get into operational compliance?
All right, so startup capital is essential in order to make it. But back to our earlier point, if we're trying to redress historical discrimination, and we're talking about communities like East Oakland, West Oakland, folks who have not had access to the capital markets, who don't have that generational wealth, who don't have access to capital. Now you're saying that this is a capital-intensive industry. How are we going to address helping folks who don't have access to capital markets to access a capital-intensive industry? That is a big challenge, a big question.
And it remains a challenge. And there's a couple of ways to look at this. I think the way that local government has tried to address this issue is through their use of equity programs and the limitation on the number of licenses that they will issue outside of their equity programs. If you want to open a store in San Francisco right now, you need to be an equity store.
Yes.
And so the financiers who see the value, see the importance of investing in a store in a market like San Francisco now have to partner with equity to take advantage of it.
Yes, and you've shared, right? So it is a gauntlet. Just like business and anywhere else, nothing is guaranteed. If you can make it through the gauntlet, if you can keep your permit and get that provisional license and get that turned into a license, on the other side, there is a tremendous reward for all of these equity operators.
It's getting to the finish line, not getting to the starting blocks.
Yes.
All right, and I think of these equity programs as getting to the starting blocks.
Yes.
Right? They're giving you a launch pad, but your business still needs to take off and fly on its own.
Yeah. And for that, you're going to have to attract private investment.
Yes. Well, some jurisdictions have put public money in place. Right? So particularly with the state now granting dollars to local jurisdictions for their equity programs. We've seen local grant programs roll out in support of these businesses. There've been zero interest loans that have been rolled out.
I love all the. We're coming up. I mean, one thing the pandemic has done is, I hope it's demonstrated the power that federal funding and right, the PPP loans. I mean, we have the ability to support any industry we want, right? We've been doing it with the airline industry forever. We did it with the car industry. I mean, we're going to do it with electric vehicles. It should also be done in cannabis.
It should be. It should be. And I think, Recently you saw state government roll out a bunch of money to support the cannabis industry. And I think that's signaling where this industry is going and what sort of political support is going to be behind it. I think there's some recognition that this industry is valuable to the California economy.
Yeah.
And so you're seeing them begin to take measures to prop up the industry. And in part because when they passed this thing, I don't think anybody anticipated the amount of time and effort it was going to take to really operationalize this industry.
Yeah.
I think the state anticipated getting a substantial amount of tax revenue a whole lot sooner, right? But they can only get that tax revenue if people are operating.
Yeah, so if you make it hard to operate, folks aren't going to be building their business in the formal economy. The informal economy is going to maintain its position, and you're not going to get the tax revenue.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like we're at the end of an era of prohibition.
Yes.
And so as we legalize, we need to make sure that we don't over-regulate, or we're going to create a barrier to formalizing. And if you can reduce the barrier to entry and people can formalize, they're going to generate tax revenue, and that tax revenue is going to help you to regulate the industry, which is going to be important to stabilizing the industry and ensuring that, right, the public is safe and taken care of. It also means that if you don't move from the informal to the formal economy, you're not going to have a cannabis business in 5 years.
You're not going to have any protection at the very least. I still think California produces more product than what they can consume themselves. And so that's always going to be the tension between the legal economy and the informal economy.
Yeah.
Right? But to the extent that California can make that transition easier, right? Or better yet, the federal government can make that transition easier, then I think you will see more people shift to the legal economy and protect their businesses.
I would love to see that. If you're existing, right, other work that I do with ESO Ventures, it's all about helping sole proprietors, home-based businesses from the informal economy move to the formal economy. Yeah. The benefits of formalizing your business, of showing, building assets, building wealth, building credit. I mean, that's going to translate to well-being, economic well-being that's tremendous. Right now, everyone who's operating in the informal economy, on paper, they have no wealth. Yeah. They can't get a car loan. You can't rent an apartment.
They can't go get a mortgage.
You can't get a business loan.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I'm excited for a day, maybe 2 years from now, 3 years from now, where the SBA, right? Think about all the government resources that we have to help small businesses. What would happen if you could take a municipal equity program, combine it with SBA, SBDC, Treasury, CDFI, loans? I mean, that would really help this industry develop.
Absolutely. And, from an equity perspective, any public resources that can come in make it easier when they have to go have that private capital conversation.
Oh, yeah.
One of the challenges here is that I think a lot of the finance community look at equity programs as a handout. And when we're in those conversations about capital structuring, it's not uncommon for them to say, well, you're not really adding value, without recognizing the fact that the value added there is that there is no permit opportunity without your equity partner, in addition to whatever fee waivers your business may be eligible through your equity partnership, regardless of whatever value comes in the form of public investment in the business. And so the more that we can stack up these value adds for equity, right, the easier it is to have that conversation and justify why that equity partner is in the position that they're in. it's not traditional capital finance, right?
Yeah.
Just like lending to this industry is not traditional underwriting.
Yes, but I think across the board, our financial system is inequitable and not meeting the needs of small business owners, regardless of race.
Well, we've talked about equity possibly being or should be a policy outside of just cannabis, right?
Yes. Yes.
Cannabis is an experiment with this concept of equity
Yes.
from a legislative perspective, and it was sort of easy to justify why equity was needed in the cannabis industry.
Yeah.
But is there any reason that equity shouldn't be applied to other industries, whether it's the healthcare industry, whether it's the financial services industry?
Definitely financial services
Right.
industry. But I'm thinking about myself as a small business owner, the types of predatory loans that I'm being offered and that sometimes I have to accept because I can't meet cash flow. Because
sharks
right? The sharks
are in the water.
The stuff you get in the mail with these little plastic thing, at these exorbitant rates, how difficult it is to understand the terms. So I imagine there's going to be a lot of predatory financing, especially if it's unregulated, if it's all private investors, things that are being done on a handshake.
It already has been, right?
Yeah.
And it's from the investors, it's from the landlords.
Yes.
In what industry does the landlord charge you a premium on rent and insist on a profit share from your business? We see that in the cannabis industry.
Wow.
Right? What other industry do investors come in?
No one does that.
Yeah, what other industry do investors come in and say, I want my entire investment treated as debt to be paid back with interest, and I want equity on top of that?
They're getting debt and equity investment?
That's happening in this industry. The sharks are in the water. And
yes.
This is part of the reason why we've advocated for all these equity jurisdictions to implement publicly funded technical assistance.
We need publicly funded technical assistance. We need public financing.
That too.
And there should be regulation, not just on the operators, but on the financial industry.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So you're giving me all kinds of ideas. I need to talk to some politicians to find out what they're doing around financial regulation. Because that is going to be a huge issue.
We still see far too many hard money loans in this industry.
What does hard money loan mean?
Think of it as predatory lending.
Yeah.
Right? I'm gonna give you $50,000 and I want 25% interest.
Yeah. Is there no regulation around that? Because you can't just do that. Right?
Look, I think part of what's worked in favor of the sharks is the desperation for capital that some of these businesses are experiencing.
Yeah.
Are some of the terms usury? Of course they are. But if you need the money and you don't have any other source to get it from,
that's right.
You were talking about some of the loans and the terms they were offering you, and you felt that you had to take it because your business was starved for capital. You needed the cash flow. It's no different in this industry. And the operators are hesitant to report abuses because they don't want to lose their business. They don't want to be shut down.
And they're going to need more private investment dollars. And all right. So you just gave me a whole nother lens on a whole nother area that I need to speak with some bankers and some financiers and some investors, because that's an important perspective to get. But to close this out, Knox family, working on the medical side, Knox and Ross Law Group, you're working on the tax and how else would you categorize it?
General business and tax support for small operators in the industry.
Cool. And you're primarily your clients are here in California, but you're working nationally.
Yes.
Just let's end with what is your call to action? What are you most excited about? where are you going to put your passions and your interests in this incredible knowledge that you've built up over the last 10, 12 years of working in this industry? Where are you looking to go, and where do you hope things go?
So a couple of things, a couple of thoughts there. I hope to see the industry continue to open up, and I think we're seeing that right now. More and more states are getting on board with medical and recreational. I think that's going to put pressure on the federal government to open things up more. I think that will benefit everybody in the industry. What I'm excited about, though, is the equity movement and how that's gained traction, not just in the most liberal jurisdictions, but in the largest markets across the country. They're now having to have this conversation about equity. And I think that's really meaningful. And then the last thing that I'm really excited about is the prospect of the medical side of this industry growing. And I think that's a little more future looking, because what we've seen to date is that states who had medical programs and then rolled out recreational programs have cannibalized some of that medical market, right? But the argument I'm positing is that the consumer adult use market is sort of baked in right about now. I think where you're going to see more growth in terms of new consumers is going to be on the medical side. Because I think people are just now beginning to understand and recognize the implication for better health outcomes using this plant, using plant medicine. And I think the more of our population wakes up to that, you're going to see growth again on the medical side. So, I think, for an investor who was looking to get into this industry, there are some very successful segments of the industry, but I think the biggest growth prospects are going to be on the medical side.
That is fascinating. And the medical side is what I'll be speaking with your sister, Rachel Knox, about. So we will get all into that. But I am so excited to have met you. I wish you much success as you continue building your law practice, as you continue evolving in this industry. And I'm sure we'll have more to say in the future.
It's been a pleasure.
Great.